and we sent to the Planning Commission and summarized here at the meeting. So with that out of the way, we've called the roll. We now look at the agenda. Luckily, it's a little bit lighter than the last couple meetings, which is good. And I think it's mostly work session heavy, and it makes sense. So if there's no other comment or concern or suggestions about the agenda, I'd look for a motion to adopt it as published.
So moved.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, a roll call vote, please.
Chair Krasner,
Yes?
Mr. Stevens,
Yes.
Ms. Teets,
Yes.
Mr. Fuentes,
Yes.
Ms. Weiss,
Yes.
Ms. Comat. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So the agenda is adopted as printed. No speaker series tonight. Any petitions received for things not on our agenda, Ms. Bazemore?
No.
Okay, just checking. Tonight we have no action items. So we're cruising right along. Although we're 1 minute late from Mr. Stoddard's prediction. 7, information items. 7A, any planning commissioners reports. It was Thanksgiving week, so I don't know if there were too many meetings that people attended, but I'm sure there was something going on. Anybody have anything to report? Not hearing anybody, and it was a quiet week. So that is, or quiet 2 weeks. That's in the meeting world. So that's understandable. I hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving and enjoyed some time off last week. Okay. Well, if there are no reports, then that takes us to 7B, the director's report. Mr. Stoddard.
Thank you, Chair, members of the Commission. It's a short report tonight. It's a report out on 2 grant applications that recently went in. The first was the city's grant application for North Washington Street, stretching from approximately the city line down to about Great Falls Street. Let's see, it was endorsed by the City Council during their regular meeting on November 22nd. And just a couple highlights from the application. The full staff report is attached, but it's a grant application for approximately $22.5 million. That would include design as well as construction. If awarded, this is an out-year grant request, as most grant requests are. For capital projects, it's an out-year grant request with design beginning in fiscal year 26, which is the fiscal year that begins July 1st, 2025. So it's 22, 23, 24, 25, about 4 years into the future. Like most of the transportation projects the city goes after, it is multimodal in nature, with the desire to improve transportation access for anybody driving, but also really to improve safety and accessibility for folks who are on foot, on bike, riding transit. It would be consistent with the city's streetscape standards. And from a fiscal perspective, there is no local match requirement. These are NVTA, Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, 70% funds the city's going after. The other grant application was a Fairfax County application. This was for the Seven Corners Ring Road. The council provided a conditional endorsement for this one. For folks who don't remember, this was part of the Seven Corners Small Area Plan that the county adopted several years ago. And there was some engagement at both the staff level as well as the elected level in advance of this conditional endorsement. There was back in the adopted small area plan, it shows the route of the ring road staying within Fairfax County. The grant application showed a different footprint with the road extending into the city of Falls Church. And so that prompted the council to provide for a conditional endorsement. And those conditions, Ms. Bazemore, if we can slide down in the report. There they were, the conditions that the city wanted to see as part of the construction of the ring road. First, that the entirety of the ring road would remain in the county, or any new route would be mutually agreed upon. Number 2, this was about truck access and making sure that any changes to Route 50 ultimately support or accommodate through truck traffic on Route 50, which currently has some restrictions. Number 3, talking through the specifics of parcel access so that parcels either inside the ring road or outside the ring road or adjacent to the ring road don't become orphaned or difficult to access. And then lastly, that not just the ring road itself be considered, but also pedestrian, bicycle, and transit access to areas around the ring road. And then engagement with the surrounding neighbors on Hillwood Avenue, and full and participation and engagement from both county and city staff. And that was the conditional endorsement, and the full staff report is attached for this one as well. That concludes my report. I guess the only other thing I might do is maybe to look ahead on the agenda. Ms. Bazemore, if we can jump back to the agenda.
Before you jump into that, just a quick question.
Sure.
For the ring road, I mean, what does the ring road mean for like North Roosevelt Street? You know, does that mean that like, you know, they would increase a lot? I mean, it's already a pretty heavily, I don't want to call it a cut through, but it's already a pretty heavily traveled street that, you know, people use to kind of navigate around Seven Corners.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, has that been part of the discussions with the county as far as what it means for Roosevelt Boulevard and North Roosevelt Street? You know, by having, you know, all that extra traffic kind of ending there. I mean, do we envision that it would require anything to be done on North Roosevelt Street?
Yeah, I see a couple hands going up. I'm not sure if that's for a discussion or for more questions.
That's for discussion. So, you know, I was on a planning commission when they first came to us and showed us their vision for the ring road. And at the beginning, their ring road actually took over Roosevelt and Roosevelt. And that was part of the ring. But they wanted to expand it. There's no room there for expansion. There's not a lot of space between the cemetery and the road. There's not a lot of right-of-way there. They also wanted to cut a road from Roosevelt behind the dealership. But then they realized, we explained to them that there was like a big grade there. There's actually like a, you know, a lot of dirt there. But anyway, yeah, I was going to say one thing I was disappointed in this listing is at the time, the neighbors along Roosevelt felt like we should be part of the discussion, not just Hillwood. That Hillwood is obviously going to be affected, but Roosevelt's going to be affected. And, you know, on one side is the cemetery and the big apartment complexes and everything, but the other side is a big neighborhood, and it could affect us a lot. And also, just to be clear, that road has limited access now, so you cannot turn onto Roosevelt Street without a pass during rush hour going towards the metro in the morning and going away from the metro in the afternoon. So that's another thing that needs to be thought about. It has the same type of pass situation that Cherry Street has, so that it would not become a cut through for metro. And the cops, when they have enough cops, pull a lot of people over at the cemetery.
That's what I was going to ask. Do we actually enforce that? I know that we have some of those restrictions, and yeah, because that's a great point. There's like a, you know, do not enter unless you have a permit sign, you know, during peak morning hour. So anyhow, just something worth talking about. Mr. Stevens, your hand is up too. Go ahead.
A couple of quick comments on the ring road. I think I agree with the council's list of concerns. It seems to defy the concept of induced demand, but I do need to read some more of the documents to get more educated on it. And then on the North Washington Street grant application, I very much support that. And if there's any way to accelerate from the fiscal year 2026 timeframe, I would heartily endorse that. As someone that's close to the intersection of Gresham and North Washington Street, it's pretty dangerous right now. So that the signalization that's planned for that intersection is really needed. And that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Mr. Puentes, go ahead. You're muted.
Sorry, just quickly, the county is accepting public comments on the project. I dropped the survey link into the chat.
Ah, excellent. Yeah, I mean, that's something that, you know, and I think I know some of the folks in the county who are working on that, but yeah, it would seem that, like, you know, to have it kind of dead kind of, just end at those streets without any thought to what that means, is obviously something that, we can, we can say it ends at the border, but if it lines up with those streets, obviously like, people in vehicles are, they don't just disappear. They got to decide which way to go. And what does that mean for their options when they get to one end or the other? I think it necessarily, outside of maybe when it's limited 6 to 9 in the morning, is going to increase volumes on that street. And what does that mean for a street that already people kind of speed through that street? It's a little narrow and windy, and people use it to get around when there's congestion in 7 Corners. I've done it. We probably all have used that street to get around there, and a lot of people do. But this would induce a lot more traffic. So anyhow, I think it's, Paul, is the staff and is the city going to be providing formal comment in addition to what the council did? Is there any ongoing dialogue that you guys are having?
Yeah, so there's a couple, to answer those in reverse order. So yes, there is, there have been some meetings at the staff level to talk through the technicals of a phasing study and things of that nature. There is a commitment on the part of the county to establish a steering committee with people from both the city and the county, and the city has communicated its or will be soon communicating its desired reps to the steering committee. And then just to go back to something you asked about, sort of, well, what happens on the surrounding streets? Just like the city would require for any private development to consider, street volumes and traffic signal impacts around a development, the county does have in their phasing study an evaluation of sort of what happens at nearby signals. So this proposed change in the route, what was included in the small area plan was that on the, if you want to call it the north side or the east side of the ring, that it would tie into the intersection at Wilson and Roosevelt, and that remains largely unchanged in their phasing study. What drew a lot of attention in their application was that in the small area plan, it showed the ring road on the west side, a much tighter configuration, and as Commissioner Teets pointed out, that was the tighter configuration was because of the engagement between the city and the county. So what was in the small area plan showed the ring road tying in short of the 24-hour fitness site. So it sort of came in sort of inside the nose of that site. And then what was in their grant application was something that showed it going through the 24-hour fitness site, which was obviously a very different situation for the city. And that's what raised a lot of the, what garnered a lot of attention.
Okay. I hear you, and that's good. Good to hear that there'll be an ongoing dialogue. I think that's important. I know this is sort of way out, long term, but this is when the decisions get made.
Well, yeah, that's why we were looking at the staff level, is that, as you start putting bridges in place, even if they're on the other side of the circle, once you put a bridge in place that defines a circle, that's kind of it. It defines the whole thing. So I think that's why we're trying to get engaged early, and that's why that first condition is there. That before you start building any portion of this thing, you got to make sure that the whole circle is or the whole route is going to work.
It's funny, as someone who goes through 7 Corners a lot, because when I was going to my office, I was going to Alexandria. I actually don't see how the ring road's going to help. It seems, at least the drawing of it seems more confusing than what's happening right now. But I mean, I don't know, Paul, you're a planner. Do you think that this, or I guess this is a transportation engineer question, but I don't see. And right now the configuration has it dumping onto 7 across from the dealership. And so that's going to be the crazy intersection.
Yeah, it sort of assumes that like a lot of the traffic going through 7 Corners wants to kind of go from get down towards like Sleepy Hollow or something. I don't know. It kind of assumes that people are trying to, I don't know. I guess the thought is if you're trying to get some of the businesses in there, it gives you some options, I guess, to access without having to everyone being on the same, arterials. But I don't know. I mean, as you said, there's a lot of through traffic. There's a lot of through volume going through there, which, I don't know. So I don't know if, how much, the ring road would be utilized. I mean, yeah, I know they've done lots of studies on it. They've been talking about this for the last, 5 years or more. But I don't know. Yeah, so anyhow, I'm sure there's some probably thick studies that have been done that project some numbers about volumes and trips and who would use it, but yeah, I agree.
I assume that, but coming from Alexandria, when I'm coming through here, a large number of people are turning on the Wilson. So the ring road doesn't do them any good. So they're just going to bypass the ring road.
Exactly. A lot of people make that movement. Exactly right. And that's what backs up the signal. If you're trying to make that left, if you're heading eastbound on Broad. But yeah, I agree.
Right. I mean, that's why I always wonder about it. And I like the concept of the bike lanes, but then basically you're taking them from you're dumping them in two areas where there are no other bike lanes. So I'm just trying to figure out what they're thinking. And I guess all we can do is keep watching it.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I put in the chat, there's a PowerPoint presentation that Fairfax County staff presented to our city council, I guess at their last meeting, and it talks about a bunch of these questions. Travel time reductions, and it's a lot of this traditional engineering, the stuff that I'm always complaining about. Levels of service at intersections, things like that. It's not very inspiring.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, well, this is actually all fairly good segue to 8B, but before we get to 8B, so anyhow, I think that's it. Paul, you finished your director's report, so
I was just going to walk through the upcoming.
Sorry. Yeah, you're right. The upcoming meetings, which, yeah, go for it.
Your next regular meeting is on December 15th, and you all have selected that date to serve for your annual advance. So there are no other business items on that night except for your annual advance. That meeting is scheduled to be in person. So scheduled to be in person in City Hall in the Dogwood Room, which is the conference room immediately off of the main hall there out of the front doors. And we will be providing sandwiches for commissioners. So that'll be our first non-remote meeting, I think, in 2 years. So that'll be exciting to see that work. And then otherwise, we're into the new year where I think you all will have probably election of officers at your first meeting in January, and then otherwise, we don't have anything on your agenda yet.
Okay.
And if that's the case, we may delay the election of officers one meeting if that's the only thing you all would be doing.
Right. We discussed that there'd be no point to just come together for that. So, okay, well, very good. I guess we need a little bit of a break after, it seems like a busy 6 or 8 weeks or so. So we are looking forward to the advance. It'll be fun. If nothing else, and I'm sure we will get a lot of good things out of the advance. It'll be nice to, get together in person, it's been so long since we've, there's some people I've never seen in person, it seems like. So it will be nice just to do that for that meeting, and I think I know I'm looking forward to that. So, okay, well that.
If
I just want to point out, we skipped 7A-1. That's on the online agenda. It's just not on the paper version. The environmental newsletter piece.
I printed out a paper copy. Environmental newsletter. What is that?
Yeah, I put that in, but that's really part of the Kate Walker presentation. It's the kind of background for that.
Okay, I saw it on the online version. I just wondered if we need to do something.
Just before we jump, if I could make a plug and request that commissioners complete their annual service survey. We've gotten one response in so far. It's very easy to calculate averages off of one survey, but I would welcome a more challenging calculation.
Okay.
Can that be recirculated?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry.
Nope, no worries. Thanks. Happy to do that.
We should do the survey. I did the survey. I toot my own horn, but I sent in the survey. So, but complete the survey. It helps staff improve, and they appreciate it. And it's helpful to just get you thinking about the way we run these meetings. I know, not to go off on a tangent, but it was things like the survey that I think helped, to try to streamline the way meetings are run, and some other things related to timing and other things. And it's helpful to know about agenda length and all that stuff. So, Please share. Okay, so now it takes us to our work session. And the first work session, 8A, is a work session on the Climate Change Mitigation Energy Action Plan. I said that all right. I know we have Ms. Walker here to discuss that. I don't know, Paul, do you want to introduce the item before we throw it over to Kate?
Just briefly to say that, this is, one link in the chain of the community's efforts really to put itself on a more environmentally sustainable path. We've only got one planet to live on. And so I think a lot of this is taking aim at sort of, how does the city prepare itself for a different sort of climate in the future, but also how does it contribute to a more sustainable world? It's important. So I'm glad the community's taken an interest in it, and the council's pushing this one forward. And it's great to have Kate's leadership on it. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Kate Walker.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for getting the title right. That's good. It's a long one, I know, but I'm sort of famous for my long titles, so I had to keep up the tradition. And we're talking about climate change here, and I think sometimes it feels like it's another priority. We're all dealing with priorities, dealing with the COVID emergency. We're dealing with affordable housing as an urgent issue in the city. We're dealing with stormwater as an urgent issue in the city. But it doesn't take away from the fact that we have to address climate change. You've seen the predictions for our region back in January, I think it was, and you've seen its direct effects. We all live here. We've seen unpredictable and extreme storms. Increasing heat is less evident, but it's not less real. And we need to respond in the way we do things. And the challenge is that the response it requires is big. There aren't small things that we can do. We've been trying for a long time, chipping away at this, but we need to have a clear path forward, and we need to be determined to do the things that need to be done if we're actually going to have an impact. So, Emily, if you could bring up my presentation. So, next slide, please. We already have established goals about environmental action. We want to be a leader in environmental sustainability. We want to be more livable, more sustainable, more resilient, and protect our community from air pollution and the effects of climate change, while reducing pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in the city. And we have established a goal for that reduction, reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases below 2005 levels by 20% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. So if we go to the next slide, you can see how we're doing against that actual numerical goal. The red line is where we are based on calculations done by Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and the green line is where we had hoped to be. And you can see we're not doing it. We're not there. One of the key reasons we're not there is shown in the next slide. The city is, as you know, an activity center for the region. It's an identified area where growth is going to occur. So although it's a little bit of a complicated graph, but if you look on the right side, the big blue bar of minus 16% is improvements in the cleanliness of the electricity that we use. But if you look on the left-hand side, there are two significant bars, one marked 12%, the other 5%, both about growth in the city, one growth in population and the other growth in commercial area, and those have both increased our emissions. And they've more than offset the reduction that we got from the cleaning up of our electricity supply. So while it's very important that we have cleaner sources of energy externally, that's not going to answer our need. It's not going to take us towards the goals that our goals fit into the regional goals fit into the country's goals fit into global goals, and we need to be doing our part. So if you go to the next slide.
Can I ask you one quick question before you leave that?
Sure.
So you're right, the largest, the red bar on 12% for growth, just increasing population itself doesn't, how is that a driver of, what is it measuring, greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so this is a measure of greenhouse gas emissions, metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And it's largely from transportation and energy use. So as your population goes up, your transportation use goes up and your energy use goes up. There is, the transportation is based on the MOVES model. So it's based on a model of transportation, but it's still extremely responsive to population growth.
No, that's what I wanted you to clarify that point. It's not just that you theoretically could accommodate population without increasing greenhouse gases, but because of the way that we are oriented, and as you mentioned, transportation is the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases in the United States. So if you wanted to make a dent on it, that's the policy lever, as opposed to, I would say, straight population growth control. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Oh, yeah. Well, population growth is one of our goals. So it's a little hard to say that we're going to stop doing that. Or, we could. Corey?
I wanted to ask the same question, and I guess I would recommend in further presentations of this that if you can break out the drivers, that would be helpful, because most of these identify a problem and a solution, and the solution here is not eliminate population, right? The solution is solve transportation and buildings and whatever. So yeah, I think that's an important part of sort of communicating where our emissions are and how we can solve them.
Yeah, I was a little concerned about this graph, but it explains why we've only achieved a 2% reduction, but perhaps not in the clearest way. I'll certainly consider a different one. But if we look at the next slide, you can see where our emissions are coming from. And yes, transportation is the biggest contributor, 42% of our emissions. But if you look at the built environment, commercial and residential together are actually more than transportation. And that's so from the transportation, it's fuel use, and for commercial and residential buildings, it's typically electricity use and gas use. There are some other sources of emissions, what are called fugitive emissions. So that's escaping refrigerants from coolant systems. The refrigerants that we chose to protect the ozone layer turned out to be really bad as far as greenhouse gas emissions go. So that's something that will be worked on. And of course, it needs to happen at the federal level. And combustion of solid waste is just a tiny part. These conversations tend to drift into recycling and never get back to the real issues. But we really have to focus on the real issues. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at what I'm trying to do with this plan. So this plan, the Action 10 from the Comp Plan Chapter 5, Environment for Everyone, says it will develop a climate risk assessment and a climate resilience plan for the city. Well, you've seen some of the regional climate risk assessment, and COG has done a regional climate risk assessment. And part of the climate resilience plan has to be climate change mitigation. So if you look at how COG structured their plan, they have 4 sections: greenhouse gas inventory scenario, climate mitigation strategy, then the risks and vulnerabilities assessment, and then the resilience strategy. So this plan essentially addresses the first 2 parts of this structure of a climate and energy plan, knowing what our inventory is and what we would need to do to bring down emissions, and then developing strategies to mitigate our emissions. And so this particular plan is really addressing energy. If you think about those emission sources, what we have to address is our energy use. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the really important part of this is to reduce energy use in the community, both in the built environment and in transportation. Anything we can't use, we need to switch to renewable energy. Burning fossil fuels, even outside the city, is not a good thing for the planet, and we need to switch to renewable energy. And, I mentioned that, for example, the greenhouse gas emissions from refrigerants need federal action. Everything in this plan needs federal action. Everything in this plan needs state action to support and enable what we want to do at a regional and local level. We can't do it alone. We really have to continue with strong advocacy measures to achieve things. Okay, next slide. So moving into specific action items, you'll find that some of these seem quite radical, and that's intentional. What I'm trying to do is stimulate thoughts, stimulate ideas about what we can do and what we need to do. But we actually need to take radical action. We cannot just, we've been working really hard in the environmental field. I mean, Tim and Corey and Melissa have all been directly involved in these efforts, and they've helped, but they haven't got us where we need to be. And so we need to redouble our efforts, and it's going to take a lot of resources. Something you're probably tired of hearing, but nonetheless, it's what we need to do. So next slide. In reducing energy use in transportation, basically the structure of the plan as it exists now, it's an outline. It's not intended to be comprehensive or to address every possible action that we can take. It's just a beginning to stimulate thought and discussion. So reducing energy use in transportation, we need to reduce transportation to and from the city, which we've been working on, mixed use and high density development, increasing transit, we've seen this year that communications can be really important in reducing how much people need to travel. And traffic management. In my original presentation, I had proposed we should put tolls on Route 7 and 29. It's a pet project of mine, but it can't be done. So let's call it traffic management and think of other ways that we could do it, maybe a congestion issue. Within the city, of course, accessible streets. Could we do some meaningful kind of intra-city transportation, the shared transportation, but within the city? And just sharing parking so that people don't have to move their car to cross the road can really reduce transportation use within the city. And then the sort of last part of changing your energy use in transportation is vehicle energy efficiency and emissions, increasing the electric vehicle market. Both, at the moment, electric vehicles are hard to get hold of. And they were even before the pandemic supply line problems. Increasing electric vehicle adoption and charging where internal combustion engines would otherwise be used. We don't want to encourage single-use vehicles. What we want to encourage is shared vehicles, micro-mobility, traffic calming, all of these things. But it's something that, every project that you work on and that you approve needs to be addressing these issues. How do we improve the transit? How are these projects impacting transit? How are they impacting communications infrastructure? Accessible streets for pedestrians, wheelchair users, bicycles, scooters. What ways can we make it easier for people to get about so that they don't automatically go to their cars? Next slide, please. The buildings, of course, are the second largest. Buildings together, home and commercial, are actually a bigger emitter, but transportation is the single largest issue. In buildings, one of the biggest challenges I think we face is that electricity just isn't expensive enough. Germany has some of the highest electricity prices in the world and some of the lowest per capita use. And I think there's a reason for that. And while, I had suggested you can tax utilities more heavily. The utility taxes right now are extremely low and they're not controlled by us. And increasing the price of electricity is a regressive tax. It affects poor people more heavily, but it may be something that we need to consider combining it with incentives and subsidies for energy use reduction and communicating to people the other motives for energy use reduction. If price isn't a driver, what is? Well, personal comfort and longer term resilience are both strong motivators for improving the energy efficiency of your home. In new construction, there are a host of ideas for, we need to make low energy use intensity. That's what EUI stands for. Energy use intensity is really important in the buildings that are going up. And we need to think about it not only in the commercial multi-family developments that we're supporting and driving right now, but also in single family homes. What can we do? Do we need to change the legislation? Do we need to work on building codes in Virginia so that homes are built with lower energy use intensity? We always need to remember that trees have a big impact on energy use. They're magic things. They provide shade in the summer and then the leaves drop off and they give, so they let the light through in the winter. It's like magic. And they grow themselves and do a tremendous amount of work for us. So we always have to remember that they're very important. I've mentioned PACE, that's Property Assessed Clean Energy Loans. These are loans for energy efficiency and stormwater improvements based that are collected through property taxes. It's a scheme that's worked in other states, but in Virginia it has been extremely slow to take off, and the prices so far have been, I've been told, prohibitively high. But if a cost competitive PACE program were to emerge, as the state is now working on one, we should probably sign up for it, work on it. And of course, new construction isn't the only place where energy efficiency needs to be improved. We're not going to replace all our housing stock. We're not even going to replace all our commercial buildings. So we need to incentivize and subsidize improvements. Maybe we need to participate in a green bank. Encourage people to use heat exchangers. One of the things I'd like to see is a program like our Solarize program that helps people put solar on their roofs, that would help them with the concept of using heat exchangers instead of more conventional heating systems. Next slide. So I'm going a little fast, so if you want me to stop or slow down or go back over something, that's fine. But even after we have made all these improvements to reduce our energy use, we're not going to stop using energy. Humans have been using energy since we invented fire, right? Or found fire. So we can't stop using energy. So the energy that we need to use, we need to switch to renewable energy. Next slide. One of the ways that we're doing this is with cleaner power from the utilities, and the Virginia Clean Energy Act was set to do that. And if it is implemented as it was intended, we'll certainly see an increase in renewable energy from the utilities, though it won't be, perhaps it won't take us all the way to the goals that we have. The other thing we need to do is to stop using gas. Fossil fuels create not just greenhouse gas emissions, but pollutants. If you have ever looked at what is in the exhaust from a gas furnace or stove, you wonder why we ever let it in our houses in the first place. It's nasty stuff, and the leaks from gas lines emit methane, which of course is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So eliminating gas and switching to electricity. I think Founders Road 2 has proposed an all-electric building, except in the commercial zones. You know, it's going to be hard to persuade chefs that they can cook on gas, but it can be done. That they can cook on electricity. Okay. We also need to increase local generation. We've got more than 40 homes now with solar on the roofs, but we need a lot more solar locally on city-owned property. I would like to investigate whether the city can lease or buy private property and put solar on that. You know, if we could put a huge solar canopy on a parking lot, both the parking lot owner and the city benefit from it. But, you know, it's certainly an unconventional approach, but it's what we need to do. We don't have a lot of space, so we've got to get solar wherever we can. And maybe that will mean that we need to create incentives, we need to do subsidies, and of course we need to provide technical assistance. We already have the possibility of a property tax exemption that would require just amending an ordinance that already exists to make it functional. And then when we can't get cleaner power from the utilities or generate our own cleaner power, we need to consider how we want to go about buying renewable energy. At the moment, for example, the city government operations buys green power from Dominion, but Dominion determines where that green power comes from. And it's in our real interest to increase renewables generation in Virginia, not out in the Midwestern states buying wind RECs that actually aren't stimulating increased renewable generation. There's a concept called community choice aggregation that we need to look into, where basically the city would become a utility. The city would buy green power and then sell it to everyone in the community on an opt-out basis. But in order to do that, we need to find a source of green power that we could buy and sell. And then renewable energy certificates and carbon offsets are also options for buying renewables, but these are sort of in decreasing order of desirability in terms of their actual real impact on climate change. Next slide, please. And just to go back to that third item in my energy action plan, number 1, reduce energy use. Number 2, switch what we can't reduce to renewable energy. And number 3 is advocacy. The city can't do it alone. We have to have federal and state legislation. We need regional support. And on top of all that, we need local action too. Next slide, please. And here's the bit where I talk about resources. I can't do it alone either. This has to be a community effort, and a community effort requires more than one staff person to support it. So Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments have what are called task order contracts with a couple of consultants who've already done plans of this nature for other jurisdictions. So if we can use these consultants, we can tap into their experience and expertise. So the sorts of things that I would like to have them do for each action item. So just to pick one, that idea of mine, we could put a solar canopy on a privately owned parking lot. We need somebody to research its feasibility, its cost, whether it's legal, and how long it would take to do that. So, and where the places are within the city to do that. So each, I think, next slide, please. I really like this action item format that Frederick, I think it's, oh no, sorry, Rockville are using. where each possible action item has a whole page description of what the action item would do, and it identifies who has to lead it, who they're working with, how it would be measured, when it could be done, what sort of costs are involved, and then a more qualitative measurement of the greenhouse gas benefits, resiliency benefits, feasibility, impacts on health, impacts on equity, whether it has co-benefits. This way we would have, and this is what I would need consultant help to do, the amount of work that goes into this one page is huge. And if I think on the next slide, you'll see that we have a very ambitious time frame for this. At the moment, I'm working with COG to define the scope of work and get a memorandum of understanding signed for that task order contract, with the idea that we would start in January working on the data and action analysis and a redraft of the plan. You know, Paul commented it's not even in plan format yet, but I think it's sort of important that it's not, because it's not yet a real plan. This is an outline of a plan, a sketch of a plan. So I thought that the structure it's in is a good way to show, you know, the structure of thought, but it needs to be obviously into a plan format. There's also, because this impacts every aspect of city operations, I'm going to have to do a lot of preparation and talking with staff about how this affects what they do. This, if we put it all into action, it's going to affect zoning, it's going to affect single family home redevelopment, it's going to affect special exceptions projects. It affects everything in the city. And that means that staff really have to be on board with what we're trying to do. If we go back one slide, just looking at this action item format, if you look at the lead and the partners, none of them are the environmental programs coordinator. It's the planning and development services, it's public works, it's the development community. So going ahead again, it's really important that everybody be involved in this plan. The idea, one of the things that's going to happen, of course, is that we're hitting budget season at the same time. But this is an urgent need, and so we've set a very ambitious schedule to try and have it to boards and commissions by April, and then to City Council and the Planning Commission for action by June. There's also a specific chunk of this that will need to be done separately and later, which is government operations energy plan. The government operations is only about 2% of the emissions in the city, but leading by example is important. So I've put that separately simply because of the volume of work we're trying to do in a limited amount of time with a limited amount of staff. And so that's the proposed schedule. So I'd like to hear from you what you think of the schedule and the idea of using consultants on this, and whether there are specific action items that you think have been omitted, action items you would like to be omitted. Any feedback that you have on the way the draft is at the moment? Tim.
Thank you, Ms. Walker.
Sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. Nice to see. I think Mr. Stevens was first. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Thank you. I had a number of comments. I read your documents with interest. I'll try to be as quick about these as I can. First of all, Kate, thank you very much for taking this on. And I hope you have a better outcome than we did 10 years ago, which is why I asked to have that document attached, because the city actually did 10 years ago try to launch a community energy plan. but then we quietly withdrew the small amount of funding that had been set aside for consulting work, and then sent the lead staff person for this project off to Fairfax Water, and that was pretty much the end of that project. So better luck this time. So you point out that the city's small decrease in its emissions since 2005 and suggest that this is largely explained by our being an activity center. And this tends to come across, I think, in your document here at least, as a reason for why the decrease in emissions has been so small. But I would point out that activity centers occur throughout the region, so we're not unique in this regard. And in fact, we were later than other jurisdictions in having our main commercial areas designated as an activity center. So other jurisdictions have achieved much larger reductions in their emissions, as I'm sure you know, also while experiencing population and commercial growth. So again, it's not unique. So I think to some degree we have to be honest in holding ourselves accountable for the actions that we haven't taken. I think the difference in that leading jurisdictions have undertaken significant planning efforts. They've hired staff. They've allocated financial resources to the cause of reducing emissions. And so I hope your project gives the city a chance to make up for lost time and do our part to significantly reduce our emissions. I agree with your asking for $125,000 for outside expert assistance. There is just no need for us to reinvent actions to reduce our emissions. And I hope the Planning Commission can support this funding request. The right consulting group, and I think the ones that you've identified there, can help with developing overlays to our greenhouse gas inventory to, for example, fully reflect the purchases of EVs by our residents, which at this point in time is not, as well as to help us ensure that the Council of Governments has accurately calculated our emissions. I also support the need to encourage emissions reducing behaviors by our residents through financial incentives. We've seen that after years of trying to encourage people to improve energy efficiency in their buildings, to install rooftop solar, to buy an EV, that only a few volunteers tend to take up these measures. And people are just not going to do these things at scale until the pricing signals are corrected. Doing the right thing is, at the end of the day, it's got to make economic sense. So I'd suggest staying away from the proposal to restructure property taxes, but direct rebates and similar financial incentives are necessary to encourage individuals to reduce emissions, and I'm glad to see you have those in your plan. I agree with increasing the utility tax to the maximum level that the state will allow us, but I'd recommend using these revenues to only reduce emissions, much like the stormwater fee is used to address stormwater problems, or the plastic bag tax is scheduled to be used for environmental problems. And in this sense, the utility tax would function like a carbon tax. I agree that limiting renewable energy certificate purchases to those generated from renewable energy produced from wind and solar in Virginia is the right policy. And in answer to your earlier question, you might want to explore developing a city program to purchase RECs from solar energy produced by our residents. Right now, as you know, many homeowners are tempted to sell their RECs to out-of-state programs, which eliminates the right of the city to use that renewable energy to reduce our emissions. So having the city buy the RECs would enable us to use those RECs to reduce our emissions, as well as providing a financial incentive to our residents to install solar. Also needed is an overall plan to convert the city's fleet to electric vehicles. So right now, there's nothing in our CIP for EVs, and the actions we do take, such as the great charging stations we have at City Hall and the announcements to purchase EVs by our police department and schools, these are done on an ad hoc basis. So the city makes decisions every day on multiple issues that have an impact on emissions. And I think you alluded to this earlier. So we need coordination across staff functions to raise awareness of how decisions affect emissions. I think we used to have something called the Green Team that considered environmental impacts on a number of fronts. And it would be good to resurrect that. And it should include school staff as well. So we've just seen recently that the ARPA funds of about $500,000 have been earmarked for Mary Ellen Henderson for HVAC upgrades. And so the question there is, do we know if consideration has been given to achieving the lowest possible emissions with this procurement? Your proposal to elevate low energy use intensity and sustainable construction to a primary criterion for special exception applications is right on the mark. And I would encourage the Planning Commission to express support for this to City Council. Along with this is the need to encourage, pretty much as you indicated, for all new developments in the city to be electric, as is the case for Broad and Washington, as well as Founders Row 2. So as the grid moves to cleaner energy, all electric buildings will experience declining emissions, whereas buildings that use natural gas will continue with emissions at the same level. On a minor point, on page 11, under actions to buy cleaner power from utility companies, you reference implementing renewable energy standards, and I'm wondering if you mean renewable portfolio standard. So I'm not sure if emissions from landscaping equipment are picked up by the Council of Government and our greenhouse gas inventory, but if they are, then having a program to convert landscaping equipment from gas to electric, like DC is doing, would be a good idea. I would encourage the ESC to support a City Council resolution to adopt a policy that the city's 2 pension funds begin to divest from firms that produce fossil fuels. This is a trend that's gaining momentum, including from recently elected Boston Mayor Michelle Wu. You've identified virtual PPAs from large offsite solar farms and the community choice aggregation as 2 programs to watch out for, as they could be game changers in terms of significantly reducing our emissions, and I would certainly agree with that. Finally, I'd encourage you to adopt a name that people can remember. Climate Change Mitigation Energy Action Plan is a mouthful. Maybe something like Emissions Reduction Plan might be more successful. But anyway, thanks again for launching this long overdue effort, and it's a good document. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Yes, I think a shorter name would be good. I wanted to stick with actually spelling out what it does for now.
All right, thank you, Mr. Stevens, for that comprehensive review. I'm sure Ms. Walker will find that very helpful. And let's see, Ms. Weiss, you're up next.
I think CC-MEEP is a terrific acronym, and we should just go with that. So I, support all of Mr. Stevens' comments, and Kate, I think it's terrific that you're doing this. It's long overdue. I sort of want to specify the action item that I think you're asking us for, just to be clear. I believe you are asking for our support for resources to hire a consultant to take this conceptual plan and turn it into more of an action plan that the city can then adopt. And I would support that very much. I think that it's terrific that we have task orders with ICF and CADMAS. I think that would be great. What I would ask consultants to do is help prioritize and tier the actions that we can take. And what I would want to see is some sort of prioritization based on where we have control versus influence, and start segmenting, the areas where the city can make decisions and really get specific about the decisions that we're making and how they influence climate change, and really identify the levers that they can pull. How does this, every planning commission decision that we make, where are greenhouse gas emissions factored in, and can we shine a more transparent light on the impact of our decisions at every board and commission and all staff levels. So I think getting to that really specific, pulling which levers has which influence will be really important, almost like a marginal abatement cost curve, but with the cost being action and time. So I think that would be, because this can be overwhelming for people to process when you throw all these things. So I think we just need a real action plan that's like, this is what we can do. This is how we can do it. Here's the lowest hanging fruit, and here's what we're going to go after. Related to that, in terms of what we control, what we don't, one of the questions I have in my mind is that one of the benefits of densification is that the more people we have here commuting downtown, the fewer people we have further out, and we're reducing the energy, the greenhouse gas emissions of commute, right? And so I have the question of, like, as our emissions go up, are regional emissions going down? So there's problems with energy intensity. That's not the right metric to look at, but it might be a metric to look at in addition to absolute emissions reductions, because if we're getting more people and more emissions, but each new person is creating fewer emissions, then maybe we're doing our part, and we might want to sort of benchmark our emissions intensity versus other activity centers' emissions activities. And that's just sort of a question maybe to throw out to the consultants as well. But I think it's terrific that you're doing this. It's long overdue. And I would support resources for developing a prioritized, operationalizable plan.
Thank you, Corey. Just to answer your question, yes, the region as a whole has made it to it looks like we're on track to make it to the 2020 goal. I know that it's already past 2020, but we won't have the numbers until next year. But it looks like we're going to make it. Reaching the 2030 goal, which was created as an interim goal for the region, will be much more difficult and require the same sort of dramatic change in the way we do things as we're discussing here tonight on a regional basis.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Weiss. Again, very comprehensive review. I know this is a subject that many of us are passionate about, but few members are particularly passionate about this topic, and we appreciate their expertise and the time they spent in reviewing that. Mr. Howard, your hand's up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Kate, for the presentation and for your deep thinking on this, and also to my fellow planning commissioners that know much more about this topic than I do. But I totally support spending resources to get a comprehensive action plan to help with our energy efficiency and reducing our carbon footprint. Which, as Corey mentioned, we might not be reducing ours, because we're doing a lot of building and getting more density, but we'll be helping the region, and that's fine too. But my question is, for Kate, is $125,000 enough? I mean, one thing I do know is comprehensive planning and consultants, and I know the ones that you have earmarked there, and I'm really wondering, to get the plan that you really want, that will help guide decisions that we make for our city, is that the right amount? Because I do fear that it's a little under what is necessary, and then maybe you're really not going to get the thorough analysis that you need. So I'm wondering whether you think we should advocate for a bit more money to get the right plan.
That was the amount that, so I discussed with COG the general idea of the scope of work in terms of analyzing the individual action items and preparing those action item sheets. But I think as these comments come in, it may be that, and as I draft a scope of work, it may be that we need to come back with more. The money there that's been identified so far as end of year funds. So it might mean requesting more in next year's budget. I don't think we would be able to request more in these end of year funds. Lots of people want to spend them, oddly enough.
Yeah, I assume that. So, but thanks.
Thank you for the question, though. I appreciate you contributing your expertise on that. Thanks. Okay,
not seeing any other hands. Again, I think overall you're hearing, obviously, the planning commission, you're kind of preaching to the choir with us. So Tim's hands back up. But before I throw it back to Tim, just obviously you're preaching to the choir, I think, with us, and anything we can do to, assist and provide feedback. I know we're part of the formal, review process I see in the timeline, but obviously, there are certain members on the commission who are particularly knowledgeable on this topic, and I'm sure some of them may reach out to you And you should feel free to reach out. I know Mr. Stevens and you are usually are in close contact on these types of issues. But overall, I think obviously the Planning Commission, is fully supportive of it. And it seems like it is time. I think since 2011 or 2010, I think, the times have changed. I mean, I think the sentiment of residents in the city, I'm speculating, is perhaps a little bit different. And same thing goes for the council as far as their support for this issue. And so I think I hope you'll find that there's a lot more broad-based support to do it this time, and I think it's needed and overdue. Mr. Stevens, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering in terms of an action that we might take if some kind of a memo to City Council that kind of highlights some of the things that we've been saying here tonight might be helpful, especially the support for the funding of the consulting work.
Ms. Walker, do you think that's something that would be helpful?
I think it would, yes. Having documented support for this would be great. Thank you.
I'd to try to draft something up, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, Tim, you're obviously, I think, well qualified, and maybe Ms. Weiss wants to, participate as well. I'm not.
Yeah, I'd say
assigning her that task, but I know she's also very passionate about this subject and raised a lot of good points in her remarks. And so, but if you want to maybe put a draft together and circulate it.
Yeah, I could send it to Ms. Bazemore, and she can send it around to everybody. Sure.
That sounds great. Okay.
Well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate your input and support. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, moving right along, that takes us to our other work session item for the evening. And our earlier discussion on the Ring Road was kind of a warm up for thinking about this part of town. It's our work session on the East End Small Area Plan, which had its kickoff public meeting or community meeting a few weeks back, and a stakeholder meeting prior to that. And so here we are with the work session. So Mr. Stoddard, I'll throw it over to you. I know Ms. Bazemore is working on this, but why don't you give us an introduction?
Yeah, I'm happy to introduce it. Tonight's staff report is going to be a bit of a tag team. Ms. Bazemore is the city's project manager on this one, so I'm going to briefly introduce it, and then Emily's going to walk through the staff report. I think I'm going to do the walk quickly through the slides just because I thought they were well received at the community meeting, and then Emily's going to walk through the actual content of the draft chapters that are included in your packet. So just by way of introducing the item, the request for commission tonight is to hold your first work session on this item and provide feedback to staff on the two draft chapters that are available. The first one is the introduction chapter, which includes a lot of history of the area. And then the second is the concepts chapter, which includes draft vision and goals. The reason for taking just these two chapters is that it reuses the model we've used on the last couple chapters, which is to engage more deeply with the commission and the council on the history of the area and the concepts that would guide the plan development before staff proceeds with actually drafting the technical components of the plan. So hopefully we can get that early direction from commission and council to make sure we're going in the right direction, and then we can come back to you with a more complete plan later in the process. Just by way of schedule, before I turn it over to Emily, as you mentioned, Chair, this has been out to the community kickoff meeting, which was held in November, and this is scheduled for a council work session tentatively at their January 18th work session. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Bazemore for the staff report.
Thank you. Tonight, the Planning Commission is requested to review and provide feedback on the draft introduction and background chapter, as well as the concept chapter of our draft East End Small Area Plan. In particular, we're looking for you guys to provide input on the following. Are the draft vision statement and goals compelling and responsive to community needs? Do the proposed concepts accurately reflect the city's priorities for the East End? Are there additional elements that should be considered in the concepts chapter? And finally, just a review of our proposed timeline for the small area planning effort. Getting into some background, we have an overview of just the small area planning process in the city and how it ties to the comp plan. The comp plan identifies several POAs or planning opportunity areas within the city. Generally, the POAs follow Washington Street and Broad Street and encompass the commercial areas of the city. The comprehensive plan describes POAs as being areas where property is currently underutilized. Redevelopment of the POAs could help improve quality of life in the city and further the realization of the comprehensive plan's overall vision for the city. Since 2011, the city has worked to develop a number of small area plans. Some of those include the North Washington Street Plan completed in 2012, the South Washington Street Plan completed in 2013, the Downtown Plan in 2014, the West Broad Street Plan in 2016, and the most recent one, of course, was the West End back in 2020. The East End Small Area Plan is the final small area plan for the various POAs in the city of Falls Church. Our planning process to date, so far, we've held a stakeholders meeting way back in September, September 15th specifically. We had representatives from the Eden Center, the Coalition for Smart Growth, Arlington County, and Fairfax County in attendance. Recently, in the beginning of November, we had a community kickoff meeting at Columbia Baptist. Public turnout was substantial. We had a very nice sized crowd with over 50 community members in attendance, as well as city council and city staff. There was a document with all the different notes received at the community kickoff included in the packet, as well as the PowerPoint presentation that Paul's going to go over in a minute. Here we have our staff analysis that includes the vision for Falls Church in 2040, and I'm just going to read that off really briefly. In the year 2040, the city of Falls Church is a welcoming and inclusive community. A special place in the heart of Northern Virginia. Involved citizens are key to the city's long-term success as a leader in education, environmental sustainability, multimodal transportation, and vibrant economic development. By investing in neighborhoods, community services, and facilities, schools, and parks, the city preserves small-town character and history while honoring a deep commitment to progress and a growing community. The continual rejuvenation of robust commercial areas support the city's high quality of life for all citizens. And that's ultimately what we're looking to do with the different small area plans for the POAs. Redevelopment of the POAs can help to achieve many of the core values that are identified in the vision above. Those include the following: small town character in an urban setting, economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, inclusiveness and social sustainability, education, mobility and accessibility, public health and safety, and of course, responsive and accountable governance. So getting into what we're bringing to you guys tonight, we have those two draft chapters included as attachments, and we're going to go over those a little bit later. To begin with, we have the draft vision statement that's part of the concept chapter, and I'm going to go ahead and read that off. So the draft vision statement for the East End Small Area Plan is the following. The East End is a cultural hub focused on the Eden Center. Transportation investments put people first by prioritizing connectivity and accessibility. Green spaces provide for opportunities for community members to gather, recreate, or relax. Nearby housing affordability is preserved while new commercial and residential development occurs within the planning opportunity area. To achieve the vision, we have the following goals. First, we have strengthening the Eden Center and cultural identity, celebrate Vietnamese American culture through programming and public art investments in the Eden Center. Next, we have enhancing multimodal mobility and accessibility throughout the East End, followed by activating public spaces to create community connections, strengthen the sense of community on the East End by providing spaces for the public to enjoy and gather, and incorporating green space for connection to nature. Following that, we have the preservation and the provision of housing opportunities in and around the East End. As the planning opportunity continues to develop, preserving the quality and affordability of existing nearby housing is important. We want to provide design transitions between existing housing and new development, and we also want to create housing that is affordable to a variety of household sizes and a range of incomes. And finally, we have a goal of supporting economic revitalization throughout the East End. Here we want to invest in the East End to create and maintain consistent economic activity and return the area to regional prominence. There is really no fiscal impact to talk about at this moment with the small area planning process. So I just want to hop into timing. Again, we've already had the stakeholder meeting, we had the community meeting back in November, and now we're in front of you guys on December 1st for your first work session. Mid-January, we're going to City Council for their first work session, and then they'll see it again in February of 2022. You guys will see the materials again also in February of 2022. And we're looking for it to be referred out to boards and commissions in February and going until April. We plan to hold another community meeting that will be super crucial, and that's going to be hopefully in April of 2022. We're looking for a planning commission action in May, and then we're looking for a city council action in June. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paul to go over the presentation.
Thank you, Emily. And I'm not going to dwell on each of these slides individually, but I thought some of these were pretty powerful slides, whether it was because of the message or the image or the positive reaction they got from the meeting attendees. And some of these won't show up again until some of the functional or technical chapters. So they may not be captured in the introductory chapter. So I wanted to go over them tonight. But this is the same slide deck we used at the community meeting. We didn't even change the title slide. Let's go to the next one. Oh, so if we could go back, I'm sorry, just to the goals for the meeting. And we said this, at the very start of the meeting. The mayor said it when he opened it up, that the point of these kickoff meetings is to provide some information out about sort of what's going on in the area, what guidance has already been sort of thought about, who's studied this area in the past. But really the idea in these early stages of the plan is to hear from folks who are at the meeting and who live in this area and know it better than we do. What do they see as the needs for the area, and what would they change if they could? So really that's what the kickoff meeting was about. And the meeting notes are captured were captured on flip charts, and we transcribed them into some notes that we attached to the packet for tonight's staff report. If we go to the next slide. Presentation agenda. So I'll just stay here real briefly. So we talked about sort of what is small area planning, which I think most folks on the commission are already familiar with. Existing conditions in the area, existing guidance, what's in the city's comp plan, what have other studies said, and then potential improvements. What could be done to make the area better for the folks who enjoy the area today and will enjoy it in the future. If we go to the next slide. What is small area planning? I think most folks know this, but it's a long range planning exercise where you're trying to look at a specific geographic area and then thinking about a long range vision, and then what steps do you need to take over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years to make sure you're making progress toward that vision. And as a small area plan, it does try to look at all facets of community needs, whether they're economic or housing or environmental or utilities, whatever it happens to be. You want to look at it in the small area plan so that you've got a cohesive vision. Next slide. Plan for planning, as Emily said, this is the last small area plan to get this kind of last planning opportunity area to get this focused attention. The city identified these POAs in its 2005 comprehensive plan and really started the small area planning process shortly after 2010, starting with the North Washington plan in 2012, working its way along the Washington Street corridor, then out the West Broad Street corridor, and now circling back to the Eden Center on the east end of the city. Next slide. Timeline, and Emily talked about this as well, but really this is meant to convey that we are at the beginning of the process, and this is time to collect as much input and guidance and direction as we can, and then that all gets sort of combined and meshed into a cohesive document that's hopefully consistent, and try to get to a council action. And the reason for aiming for that June action date, a couple reasons. Some of them are pragmatic, right? That this is one, it's in the council's work plan to get it done on this timeline, so that's what we're trying to do. But also we found that we get a lot of mileage out of these sort of shorter planning exercises. We found that if we can get a planning exercise through in 9 months, maybe a year, that we've still got a lot of energy and we've got a lot of enthusiasm for the follow-on actions. If we go to the next slide. Next. So this is what's in the area today. I think folks probably know this. Obviously, you've got the Eden Center, but also the BJ's Wholesale is on the far eastern edge of the city. And the Eden Center, if folks haven't had a chance to walk it recently, it really is a success story that even during the pandemic, there are almost no vacancies in the whole place. And it really is a unique format for what you would otherwise see in these sort of suburban settings, where it's not you drive to the parking lot and there's, you know, a couple category killers. There isn't the sort of Home Depot, Old Navy, and bookstore. It is these three internal, in addition to the shops you can see from the parking lot, there are these three internal malls that are just these amazing spaces of these things that you can't otherwise find in the region. And it's what makes the Eden Center one of the most sort of amazing success stories and one of the biggest Vietnamese Vietnamese American shopping centers in the country. So it's really quite impressive. Next slide. Transportation network. Like I said, it's a multifaceted planning exercise, so it's not all economics. So this is the transportation setting anyway. For the area, you got a lot of transportation pieces coming together. You've got transit with the East Falls Church Metro to the north and the bus hub in Seven Corners. You've got Capital Bike Share, which extended through a partnership with Arlington and Fairfax and City Falls Church, close to the Eden Center, the closest we could get because the easement reasons was Roosevelt and Roosevelt. You've got bus service with the 28A now running, I think, 12-minute headways all day, coming down Roosevelt Street. You've got the W&OD running to the north. You've got the under construction Route 50 trail, which connects City of Fairfax to Fairfax Circle to the DC line. That's under construction along 50 in various phases. And then, of course, the roadway connections. You've got Route 57, Wilson, which takes you out to Ballston. You've got Roosevelt Sycamore, Route 7, Sleepy Hollow. They all come together in this interesting configuration. If we go to and I'm sorry, what's shown on the slide is the adopted road network that was in the Seven Corners small area plan from Fairfax County. You've got the ring road, sort of circumnavigating the Seven Corners interchange, and then a new street grid to the west where they're planning for redevelopment and mixed use. If we go down a slide. Transportation on the ground, so that's the map, but when you actually get on this, it's funny, I looked up the walk score for this area, and it's a walker's paradise, according to walk score. There's a small flaw that it only looks at the geographic distance to you know, how far is the coffee shop, how far is the bank, how far is the dry cleaners. It doesn't actually have to walk it. And that's what's shown in these images here is that, yes, there are crosswalks, but they're not very close together, and they're hard to use. There aren't enough of them, and the land uses are really the development form is spaces these things so far out that even if you have the crosswalks, it's, you know, you're still only halfway there to where you're trying to get to. If we go to the next slide. So this is the environmental story in the area. 78% of the area is impervious, either from surface parking lots, roadways, or building rooftops. And so we've got an image in the lower right of sort of what that looks like. So this is a site that meets all the city's requirements for site plans. It's got all the interior lot landscaping that's required. But when you look at it, you know, in combination with what's going on around it, it is not a good environmental picture. If we go to the next. Oh, and this was labeled stormwater, just to point out that, right, any drop of rain that falls on the ground here has probably got to find a way through the city's stormwater system because there's nowhere for it to go here. If we go to the next slide. You can see that connection between impervious surface and street trees, and you can see how that works out. So you've got the interior lot landscaping, largely those light green circles. You've got some street trees along Roosevelt, and then you've got some landscape buffers between the residential multifamily and the commercial areas. And so that's a look at sort of how that impervious surface translates into tree coverage. If we go to the next slide. So this is an economic take on the area, and we did include as one of the draft goals the economic revitalization of the area. That, of course, is one of the key principles for getting the POAs recognized in the first place. There's a lot of numbers on this slide that I'm just going to sort of walk through, not all of them, but if you look at the East End POA, the top line, total assessed value in the area for all 43 acres is $167 million. And 68 million of that is coming from the building values. In comparison, if you look at either the 301 West Broad or 455 Tinner, the last two lines, about 2 acres each, their building assessed values were $72 million and $71 million respectively. So just those buildings by themselves are assessed at a higher value than all the structures in POA 5. So when you think about the city's tax revenue, and this is just on property taxes, it's not on meals taxes, business taxes, any of those other things, just on the structures alone, the city generates $914,000 in taxes from all the buildings in the East End, and it generates $958,000 from 301 West Broad and 455 and 949 from 455. So then we included the graphic of FAR, because what's going on here is that you've just got more building, you've got more square footage, you've got more activity on the same amount of land. So if we go down a slide, property and ownership, it's largely large acreage ownership. Eden Center, 15.6 acres. Coons is, they have 2 acreages. They've got the 6 2/3 where the dealers are, and then the almost 3 acres where they've got a body shop along Roosevelt. You got the BJ's at 8.7. You've got some smaller uses. There's the public storage at 1.4, and then that's the 24-hour fitness at 3 acres. And then not included in the POA, but we highlighted on this graphic, you've got 11.25 acres in the adjoining cemetery. And we did hear from meeting participants that they actually enjoy that as an open space today, going for strolls, doing stargazing. So it is an opportunity that could be taken advantage of. Next slide. Recent and private investment. So there has been economic activity, economic investment in the area. Largely, it's renovations of existing buildings on the city side of the line. And then on the county side of the line, the Lauren building went in 2017, which is a mix of retail on the ground floor and then residential above. Next slide. This is just talking about transportation investments near the area. The city CIP recently put in some money near the area to redo the intersection of Roosevelt and Roosevelt, as well as to extend bike share near the area. If we keep going. Comprehensive plan today calls for the entire POA to be used as a business use. That's the red color. And then around that, there are, of course, other uses like the residential multifamily, creative design, and then single family residential. If we go to the next slide. Comprehensive plan talks about the importance of gateway areas, with the East End being one of them. That's the graphic in the upper left. And then revitalization of the planning opportunity areas with appropriate transitions to the surrounding residential areas. If we go to the next slide. Virginia Tech, so this was back in 2009. This was a student-led study and talked about, what would be sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation if you saw a total redevelopment of the area. And here they were talking about, increasing the density by a factor of 4, getting 3 million square feet of development. So obviously there's a lot of room for development. But then the pieces that would be needed to support that, the ped bike network, the multimodal transportation center, a circulator system, the idea of more density in the area reflecting an urban model instead of a suburban model. If we go to the next slide. So this is the ULI TAP, Urban Land Institute completed a technical assistance panel in 2018. One of the things that I really liked about their study, so they developed it in phases. We only included one of their end graphics here, but they had an intermediate graphic as well that showed in some filling in of the surface parking lots. The other thing that I thought was pretty good about this was the way that they used the Seven Corners small area plan ring road configuration as the launching point for a walkable grid on the city's portion of that. So if you look at that graphic in the lower left, you can see a conceptual design for the ring road streets, and then they've circled in red those tie-in points to the city's land areas and how you could break up those super blocks into a more walkable grid. If you go to the next slide. Jurisdictional partnerships. So obviously this stuff doesn't stop at the city boundary. And so continuing to work with Arlington and Fairfax, not just on transportation, but also utilities and parks. We didn't take very long. We actually researched the nearest parks to the area. Obviously you've got Fort Taylor Park at the Hill, but then otherwise the two nearest playgrounds are both approximately a half mile away. You've got Benjamin Banneker in Arlington, and then you've got Azalea down off of Hillwood in Fairfax County. Go to the next slide. So here's the Fairfax County plan for the area, the ring road around the intersection, and then redevelopment to the east of that, mixed use, walkable street grids, a host of investments in the area. If we go to the next slide. The ring road itself, here's what was adopted in their plan, showing the ring road tying into 7 east of the city boundary there, sort of outside the city boundary. And certainly that's what we would expect to see going forward. If we go to the next slide. Arlington, they're doing a planned Langston Boulevard effort now. But this is the plan they've still got on the books for the East Falls Church metro area, which calls for transit-oriented development around the metro station and then a tapering off to areas around it. Go to the next slide. Potential future investments. So, right, the importance of strengthening the Eden Center, right? The number of festivals that go on there, the cultural weight that this thing carries. It's, how do you support that? And what are things in the plan that could help that? We talked about, could senior housing, there is no housing at the Eden Center today. So could senior housing help? Could a hotel for out-of-town guests help? What about more supply? So one of the reasons they aren't reinvesting in the property is because they don't have anywhere else to put the cars. And so can we find some way to be more efficient with the cars so that we can actually open up more land area for more activity? Can we do something about signage? And I'm going to leave some of this for Emily's stuff here. If we go to the next slide. Public amenities, and I'm actually going to leave all of this for Emily's stuff because I know we touch on this pretty early on in the concept chapter, but a number of meeting participants raised the importance of more green spaces, more places for people to gather. Right now it's largely parking lots, small sidewalks, and shops. Can you have more public spaces in there? Next slide. Regional connections, of course, this area doesn't stand on its own. It obviously relates and connects to everything around it. And so one of the things we tried to talk about is sort of what are those tie-in points, right? The constellation of spaces in the region. Can we get investments in Wilson Boulevard to really highlight that connection to Ballston? Can you improve Roosevelt to get a better connection to East Falls Church Metro? How does this tie into the areas around it? If we go forward, another one. Regulatory changes. So this is sort of, what are the rules in place? Are the rules in place supporting and encouraging the kind of redevelopment that's in the vision? Or are they actually a barrier to it? So can we do things with zoning to make it easier to get from M1 zoning, which is what it's zoned today, to some of that greater variety of uses that are available in the B districts? Can we work with Fairfax County on a boundary line adjustment? You can see there's an orphaned parcel in that lower right corner where it's not shaded in gray. It's north of Wilson, but it's not inside the city. And so it's a very difficult parcel for Fairfax County to deal with because it is a very small acreage and it doesn't connect to anything else inside the county. And then also continued flexibility for outdoor dining and entertainment. That's something we heard from the representatives from the Eden Center, that they're getting a lot of value out of those outdoor dining spaces. And is that something that can be continued going forward? Next slide. Investments. So, right, this is, right, it's not just public investments, it's not just private investments, it's the two of them working together to make a better place for people to live in. And so it's, it's investments in transportation, it's investment in public spaces, it's investments in art, it's investments in the buildings and the buildings and the businesses and the homes that are sort of either there or nearby. While also preserving what's working in the area, whether that's affordable housing options nearby or the activity and the vibe that's already in the area. If we go to the next slide. Recap and discussion. These are just all the things that were touched on in the presentation, and close with a satellite image of the area again. So those were the slides we gave at the kickoff meeting, and now I'm going to turn it over to back over to Emily for a walkthrough of the draft content.
Okay. We're going to start with chapter 1. And I'm going to run through it really briefly as I want to focus more on chapter 2, which is where the concepts lie. So our chapter 1 is, as always, an intro chapter, and it provides some background information on the POA. So first, we're going to start off with the purpose of the small area plan itself, and that is for providing. Well, first, I'm going to go into how it ties to the comprehensive plan because I think that makes more sense. But of course, the city's comprehensive plan serves as a guide for future development in the city. And then we're going to hop to the POAs now and how those tie into small area planning. So within the context of setting policies for development of the city, the comp plan identifies several POAs. You can see the planning opportunity area map on the following page. The comp plan describes our POAs as areas being or areas where property is currently underutilized. We touched on this in the staff report, but I'm just going to go through it again really quickly. Redevelopment could help improve quality of life in these areas of the city and further the realization of the plan's overall vision for the city. So the small area plan that we're working on right now is for POA Area 5. This plan is intended to provide an area-specific framework for redevelopment that supports and builds upon the guidelines established in our comp plan. All right, moving forward, we have our plan for planning, which was seen in the previous presentation. So I'm just going to note right here, again, POA 5 is what we're looking at for the small area plan. Next, we have geography and regional context. We have some nice graphics that kind of show the development of the area over the years. So here we have basic farmland, and then all the way to 1990, lots of roads. Then again, we have another aerial image. This was also seen in the PowerPoint presentation, but just gonna note, here's Eden Center, here's the BJ's, here's the Coons property, and then of course 24-hour fitness out on the left. Our methodology, this kind of gets into how we proceed with meetings with you guys, whether it's Planning Commission or City Council, as well as our stakeholders meetings. And we already had that one stakeholder workshop back in September. And then we had our community meeting in November, and that's already included in our methodology section. But we're also probably going to have another stakeholder workshop, and we will definitely have another community meeting. So we'll have to plug those in later. Ultimately, it'll be referred out to boards and commissions, but it's approved by the City Council. For history, we have a little bit of American Indian history written up. It kind of gets into how Route 7 actually used to be an American Indian travel route, which is kind of neat. And then we have a section on the colonial era and Civil War. Something to note is the Oakwood Cemetery, we have some images down here, was actually the site of the first Methodist meeting house in the area, which is pretty neat. All right, and then we have our African American history. Something to note here is that we have the Foote property. Frederick Foote Sr., he actually purchased 28 acres of land from the man who enslaved him back in 1864. This land is now what we know as Eden Center, as well as Coons Ford and the Seven Corners Shopping Center. We have some content on post-World War II, the different history of the area there, and some nice images towards the right. And then we have a section on recent reinvestments in the East End. And I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next slide because it kind of tells us more about that. We have a nice chart. So for BJ's, what it used to be before reinvestment was Nolan Plumbing. And now it's BJ's. 24-hour fitness used to be the Sims department store, and now it's a fitness center. All right, and then we move into planning guidance and past studies. Of course, we always start with the comprehensive plans guidance and land use and zoning, urban design, and transportation. Also, we have a little section right here that just states there have been no land use or zoning amendments in the East End since 2005. Okay, and then we touch on the Fairfax County Comp Plan update for Seven Corners with a nice rendering of the proposed redevelopment in Seven Corners. And then recent planning studies that were also included in that presentation. So again, Virginia Tech student study back in 2009 and the ULI TAP back in 2018. And then we also have some citations. All right, and now for Chapter 2, this is our concepts chapter. This is where we're going to find our vision statement that was discussed in the staff report. Again, I'm just going to read that off. The East End is a cultural hub focused on the Eden Center. Transportation investments put people first by prioritizing connectivity and accessibility. Green spaces provide opportunities for community members to gather, recreate, or relax. Nearby housing affordability is preserved while new commercial and residential development occurs within the planning opportunity area. And then the goals are listed again, but I'm not going to reiterate those because each page kind of gets into each of those. So to start with our first concept, our first planning concept that we drafted is strengthening the Eden Center and its cultural identity. We kind of have a little blurb right here that explains the history of Eden Center, and it ties into the fall of Saigon and the Vietnamese War and the immigration, thousands of South Vietnamese refugees to the U.S. One of the most notable enclaves in the Vietnamese War happened to be, for the Vietnamese, sorry, happened to be Clarendon and Arlington, so nearby. That's where many Vietnamese shops and restaurants began to flourish. However, with the beginning of the metro construction, land values and disruptions forced many of the Vietnamese to abandon Clarendon and come over to Falls Church. Again, yeah, many moved west to the Plaza Shopping Center on Wilson Boulevard and Falls Church, and that's how Eden Center came to be. Today, Eden Center is, of course, the largest or one of the largest Vietnamese shopping meccas in the whole United States. So we want to really make this a focal point for the POA, as it kind of already is, and we want to look for ways to strengthen it. So how do we do that? We create a space for the celebration of Vietnamese culture. Over the years, they've hosted events such as the Moon Festival and the Mid-Autumn Festival, their two biggest events. They have movie nights and smaller events on site. So we're looking to have a permanent public plaza where event programming can occur at the Eden Center, thereby creating a real international town center feel. It would be great for visitors, but also the business owners who could have a space to relax and linger. We have some nice images from the different festivals that happen at Eden Center. Here we have the Lunar New Year celebration. All right, and then we can also celebrate cultural identity and strengthen the Eden Center by bringing in some public art. This planning opportunity area happens to be part of the city's arts and cultural district, where we're, of course, encouraging investment in public art. We think that murals and sculptures and other forms of art would really beautify and add vibrancy to the Eden Center. It could visually transport visitors to Vietnam and offering a really creative, memorable experience. Finally, we want to possibly rename the portion of Wilson Boulevard that runs from Arlington County into the city to Saigon Boulevard. This would create a gateway to the Eden Center and communicate a sense of identity when you enter the city of Falls Church. And I just want to point out this cute little mural. This is actually from San Diego. They have a little Saigon out there. So just an example of a mural that might look nice in Eden Center. Our next concept is enhancing multimodal mobility and accessibility. Here we kind of talk about how the East End is really a hub for connections. Current facilities that we have for transportation include, of course, the East Falls Church Metro, which I use all the time to commute to work, and the Seven Corners Transit Center. A bus rapid transit center is planned for the area. The area includes already bikeways and pedestrian ways such as the WOND Trail and, of course, the currently under construction Route 50 Trail. The major roadways in the area are Route 7, Route 50, Wilson Boulevard, and the nearby I-66. Collectively, the transportation facilities connect our East End to Seven Corners, Bailey's Crossroad, Maryfield, Tyson's Corner, the Roslyn-Ballston Corridor, DC, and the city of Alexandria. Right now, there are several multimodal barriers and needs that exist in the East End. There's a lack of an internal street grid, fences, and vegetated screening and parking lots are some barriers to the goal of creating improved connections to adjacent sites, which would ultimately create a more cohesive feel on the East End. And our images that we have over here, down at the bottom, we have a nice example of a walkable and engaging streetscape, which is kind of an aim for this POA. Our next subsection is our pedestrian and bike experience. We're looking to improve street design to make it more safe and comfortable for pedestrians and cyclists. This is something that we heard a lot about at the community meeting. People don't feel that it's a safe place to walk or cycle. There are wide streets, there are isolated parcels, very intimidating crossings, uninviting streetscape overall. So we're looking to fix those impediments and incentivize walking and cycling in POA 5. The barriers to walkability and cycling can be overcome by widening these sidewalks, planting more street trees, providing safe and frequent crossings, orienting the buildings towards the street, and designating protected bike lanes. Our next subsection is creating a street grid. The East End POA would benefit from a revised street grid, breaking up these large blocks and providing frequent safe pedestrian crossings. Street networks should connect adjacent parcels to increase accessibility to adjacent sites, something that's really lacking right now on the East End, not very connected. We're looking to create great streets. Wilson Boulevard connects several major sites, and it acts as the southern boundary edge to the POA, as well as the city. It should be treated and celebrated as a great street. Here we could widen our sidewalks again, and again, add some street trees and provide streetscaping amenities. Again, we want to bring those building facades onto the street. And another thing that we could do to kind of create a great street would be renaming it to Saigon Boulevard, as mentioned previously. Also, the Fairfax County Ring Road, something that's going to be important in the future as Fairfax continues to plan for their portion of the area, is just us continuing coordination with them to ensure that the proposed ring road meets the needs of not just their jurisdiction, but our jurisdiction. Our third concept is activating public spaces for community connections. Eden Center as a public gathering space. Again, we talked about the different festivals that they have and the different events that already exist there. Numerous cultural events and parades and movie screenings happen at Eden Center throughout the year. So we see that this site is already being used as a flexible event space. The high turnout for these events is evidence that there is a demand for more gathering spaces and, again, specifically a public plaza. Spaces for children. This is also something that came out of our community meeting and something that you guys may have noticed on the flip chart notes. People really brought up that there's no playground in our area. The nearby playgrounds are in Fairfax at Azalea Park, and then Benjamin Banneker Park back in Arlington County. So we're looking to create spaces for kids to play, and a really nice image is on the right, very top. An urban park designed for recreation and play for children. Pocket parks, specifically the potential for Fort Taylor Park to become a pocket park would be a great way to integrate some green space into an area that, again, is 78% impervious, which is absolutely crazy. Future private and public reinvestment would allow for the opportunity to soften the urban landscape by providing access to pocket parks. Often a combination of hardscape and greenery, pocket parks serve to break up monotonous scenery by providing the public with moments of variety and reprieve. The East End Farmers Market. This is a relatively new idea. We have a farmers market in the city already. It's very successful with over 40 local farmers and producers, and it draws people from all over the area. So perhaps we could implement something similar on the East End, whether on the same day or a different day, thereby making the East End a larger regional attraction. Our next concept is housing. So today the East End consists entirely of commercial uses. To increase the vibrancy of the area and to keep up with local and regional housing demand, housing opportunities should be provided in the POA. New multifamily housing, new housing construction would focus mostly on multifamily at a variety of densities, and it should be geared towards the expansion of inclusivity. Like Paul talked about in the presentation, something that we had leaned into with housing is the addition of senior housing. Many of the business owners and patrons in Eden Center are part of an older population. They often travel from neighboring areas of Virginia as well as Maryland. Senior housing would provide or remove the transportation barriers that prohibit the ease of access to Eden Center. Senior housing would also allow this population to age in place and remain in the community where they've played such an integral role. Family-size housing. Right now, there is a shortage of family-size housing in the city. 2-bedroom rental homes and 3-bedroom rental homes are very underserved. The East End could offer the potential to help solve this shortage as it continues to evolve. Condominiums. We think that condominium housing attracts a diverse group of residents in age and income and household size, and also offers this opportunity of home ownership for residents. So this particular POA could be a very attractive area to have the construction of condominiums. And finally, perhaps the most important is the preservation of nearby housing and its affordability. Housing near the East End ranges from multifamily rental units and owned condominiums to single-family homes. The existing housing stock near the East End is accessible to a variety of incomes and family sizes. This lends to inclusivity and diversity in the community. To maintain affordability in the city, the existing housing options should remain. We want to retain a quaint neighborhood character of the adjacent community. This is something, again, that was reiterated at our community meeting. So perhaps a design transition could be included to separate the residential and the commercial field. All right, and our last concept is the Eastern Gateway's economic revitalization. Right here, we kind of talk about the economic activity that exists already in the East End and kind of returning it back to regional prominence. A lot of the economic activity is tied to the Eden Center. So here we have a blurb about ongoing investments in existing properties. So what that would look like could be ongoing private investment from Eden Center to bolster continued economic activity. These could be facade renovations or tenant fit outs, interior renovations, the expansions of sidewalk dining, private murals and art. Larger private investments later may include parking garages, as Paul mentioned in the presentation, a hotel, plazas, and of course senior housing, all of which would further engage the community and solidify its position by attracting future businesses to the area. Infill and redevelopment, right now there's quite a few large surface level parking lots. So we're looking for future revitalization efforts that would benefit that would, of course, support infill redevelopment or infill development and redevelopment with higher densities. Again, kind of pulled from the presentation, we have an example of 301 West Broad and how the building alone produces an annual property tax revenue of $958,000 on a 2.8 acre site. Comparatively, all of the buildings in POA 5 produce $914K in tax revenue across approximately 40 acres. Drastic difference. And following this, we have investments in the public realm. The East End is one of 4 identified gateways in the city. A sense of arrival into the city can be accomplished through unified streetscape design, signage, and eye-catching monuments, art, or architecture. Again, we want to widen those sidewalks for improved connectivity. Streetscape amenities, street trees, and murals are examples of public investments, which the city can use to assist in reinvestment. And to follow up with this, we have the East End is geographically separated from other commercial areas in the city, and the commercial uses are unique. Localized East End branding, in addition to Falls Church's branding, can help build the POA's sense of place while also linking it to the rest of the city. And that's all we have for our concepts chapter so far. So I want to open up the floor to some discussion on chapter 1 as well as chapter 2.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Baisby. Getting a little bit of an echo there. Well, let's see. I don't know who wants to kick this off. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about, and I know we're going to see this many times. It's going to continue to evolve, I guess. Trying to think the best way to organize it. Yeah, I don't know if it matters if people want to talk about one chapter versus the other. I mean, the first chapter is more kind of, the framework and history as opposed to the actual recommendations. So, well, I don't know. I don't really have a great way to structure it. I guess we'll just let folks have at it since, this is the first of what will be multiple conversations on this chapter. So I think Mr. Hira's hand popped up first. Why don't you start us off?
All right. Well, thank you for the presentation. You guys did a great job, covered a lot of ground. And I guess I have a couple of comments, but, one is that it's clear that there's substantial investment going on, right? Like this is our sort of small area plan. But we've got the investments going on by Fairfax and also Arlington. So I think we need to think about our sort of planning vis-a-vis all the other things that are going on in that area. And it's an area that is kind of chaotic, right? It's not a walkable space. It needs a lot of improvement. But at the same time, we also, I think, should underscore how important the Eden Center is. And as a Vietnamese place of gathering, not just for Fairfax or Arlington or Falls Church, but for the entire DMV area. The other part is that those small businesses have a history and legacy of being displaced from Arlington. And that is part of the history of the Eden Center. So I think it was sort of, mentioned in our history chapter, or maybe it was in chapter 2, and there's a little paragraph on the Eden Center. But I think we should say that the small businesses were displaced, because they were. And they were displaced from a planning process. And we are now engaged in a planning process. And that idea of potentially being displaced is going to be front and center on the small businesses that are there now. And Paul, you mentioned that, it's the pandemic, but when you go over there, there's vibrancy, there's very little vacancy. That is related to the customer base that goes there from all over the DMV. And it also relates to the low rents that those small businesses pay. And I don't know how they've all survived. I don't know what the rent structure is or how it's changed. But I do know that community bonds and does what it needs to do to survive. So any investments, maybe not even at the Eden Center, but in the other areas that and the other counties and cities that are doing it, Paul, you put up the slide about the amount of tax revenue that could be generated. And if we are thinking about increasing density in that area, and I do love that we're talking about, mixed use and residential and the affordable housing, but any investment in that area will drive up the property values and it will then drive up the rents of the small businesses that have already been through a displacement process. So I think we have to be really careful and cautious, and also we have to acknowledge the history that has happened to this community of small businesses. And I think that we have to be very explicit with saying we understand that history, we know that history, but also we are going to put policies in place not only to develop affordable housing, but also to ensure that the small minority-owned businesses can stay in place. And I did not hear anything about our concept of ensuring the stability for the small mom and pop businesses that are there now. We have to have that part of this plan if you want to get the Eden Center's buy-in. It just has to be part of it. Otherwise, this will be seen as controversial, and it will be seen, even though we don't intend it to be, but it will be seen as, well, Arlington displaced these businesses, and now Falls Church is going to do it. So we have to think about the residential, but we also have to think about the commercial and be real intentional and direct about preserving the vibrancy that is there right now while we upgrade. So I have many other things, but I just wanted to put that on the table first. And I'm sure other commissioners are going to have other comments that hit other parts of this area. But I think that is really critical that we go forward in a way that we understand this could be perceived as a displacement process, a commercial displacement, and we are doing everything possible to prevent that from happening again, as it did happen in Arlington.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Those are all good points. I mean, I think that's very true, especially, we start talking about adding residential, into the mix here, and quickly, you start thinking about, inducing developers to come in and redevelop a lot of, these, large strip, style centers with lots of surface parking, which, from a planning perspective, there may be some design elements of that are attractive, but, right, the Eden Center in some ways is not a typical shopping center, which which the report does identify. But I agree, we have to be very careful in how we approach that. Again, given the history, so I think that's a very valid concern. Ms. Teets, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to just congratulate the staff. I thought the 2 chapters were really well done. And I do think this is probably the most difficult area to plan, because we do have the Eden Center, and also because we don't have the ability to do mixed use here. Everything here is pretty much locked in. I mean, we've included Oakwood Cemetery, but there's not much you can do with Oakwood Cemetery. I don't know if you've been in the cemetery, but they're to the point now where they are starting to add grave sites into the unutilized areas. They're spreading pretty widely, so there's not like any open space in there, and I will just say it is actually very walkable there, more than you might think, because we walk from our house, which is across from Fort Taylor Park, to Eden Center all the time. We walk to 24 Hour Fitness, and thank God for the new crosswalk at 7 and Roosevelt, because it's much easier to cross there now. You can walk, and we walk to the dealership all the time. That's, we have Fords, and because we can walk to the dealership, we usually use them. So there is some walkability there. But the problem really is trying to walk into 7 corners. The parts that are City of Falls Church are actually pretty walkable right now, and bikeable, because the cemetery will let you bike through it, so you can take your kids through the cemetery. So the cemetery actually has been a really good neighborhood partner. They do allow you to walk through it, and because there is no sidewalk along that part of Roosevelt, and people, almost everyone I know in our neighborhood has taught their kids to ride a bike in Oakwood Cemetery, because they have all the interior streets. But I'm just like, I really struggle with this. We have talked about this in the past, and I remember one of our thoughts which we thought would be really cool, would be to put in like a hotel at the front of Eden Center to serve as a place where people could stay. Now, you may not be aware of this, but we do get big motor coaches there. Occasionally people will come from fairly far away. I swear one time they had a motor coach from California that stopped there even. It was like, so they do get people that come that just to go to Eden Center. There's a lot more to it than what you see from the surface. There's a lot of it. There's interior corridors and there's like a downstairs area and there's a lot more in there than you may actually conceive. Most people just know the outside edges. But, you know, I just look at it, I'm just not, you know, it's going to be interesting to see what we come up with for it because we are pretty much locked out right now. Because I don't see the dealership leaving. I don't see the, like 24 Fitness property might be the only one that could come into play if we could find a development that the current landowners would be willing to invest in. But it was almost impossible to get 24 Fitness there because they didn't want to do any remodeling. They just wanted, you know, these are like second, third generation landowners who don't know this property and they just want their monthly check. So it makes it really hard. You know, I don't see, you know, obviously BJ's is fairly new. I don't see, but you look at the BJ's properties, there's a lot of property there. And not all the parking's being used there. So of Eden Center's parking's pretty much used 100%. But BJ's, if you go to there, the outer lots are not being used. So I think our best chance of pulling some property and maybe getting a little bit of a park in that area would be if we could get the front piece of that property. Because if you do a parking count there, you're going to see almost all the lots along Wilson, all that section is empty almost every day. So I'm just, you know, I'm trying to, like, Eden Center is not like that. Eden Center is like, so the reason you walk there is because it's hard to park there. You know, even today I went by at lunchtime and it was still crazy full of people. Anyway, I just wanted to give my thoughts as someone who lives really close to it and goes there a lot and walks around this neighborhood a lot.
Thank you, Ms. Teets. Let's see, Ms. Weiss.
Yeah, I'll just be really brief. I think it's a good start. I wanted to underline Derek's comments, which were put much more articulately than mine, but I did have an immediate reaction when I read strengthen Eden Center, and my immediate reaction was, is it strengthen or is it preserve? Because Eden Center is an icon, it's amazing, it's an asset, and I think we should do everything we can to preserve and support that very unique asset in the city. And so support, you know, including some language in there about supporting and preserving the small businesses. And I also wonder if the way to look at the financial impact is to look at the other benefits besides property taxes. I don't know what the impact would be or what the magnitude would be, but I think there are other benefits besides property taxes or that we might see from that. The other two things I just wanted to mention are, you know, and I don't, you know, Melissa's got a lot more insight than I do in terms of the challenges of developing there, but you know, to the extent that we do have development, you know, we just came off a conversation about the CCMEP, Climate Change Mitigation Program. We just implemented Chapter 5 or approved Chapter 5 on the environment last year. And it seemed to me that, you know, environmentally sustainable development was woven in a light touch, but I'd like to see that emphasized more, particularly to the extent that we get, you know, buildings or in there that they be green. So I would just like to see, you know, more emphasis on environmentally sustainable development in there as a concept. And I know that housing, you know, we mentioned affordability in there and maybe just mentioning the need for housing is enough. But again, this, you know, we've talked a lot about the need for more affordable housing. So I think just highlighting that and elevating that and the POA would be, or the small area plan, I think would be helpful as well. Oh, and I did have one last question, and this is not about the small area plan, but it's a comment that I made last time, which is, you know, these small area plans come out as 100+ page documents. And, you know, maybe this isn't the place for that, but is that effective? I mean, are we getting, are these small area plans serving their purpose, given how much stuff is in there? Are they helping to prioritize and guide, or are we throwing so much stuff at the wall that you can find what you want in it and leave what you don't? So that's sort of philosophical question about how we approach these.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Weiss. I don't know if staff wants to respond to any of these kind of questions, or we can kind of let you guys jump in at the end. Mr. Fuentes, I think your hand was next.
Thanks. I'll be brief too. This was great. Thanks to the staff. This is a complicated area. I do think the vision is compelling. I'm really glad you like that you're calling it a cultural hub right out of the box. I think that's certainly something that's good to emphasize. I think the goals are good. I had a reaction to the term economic revitalization, kind of along the same lines of what Mr. Hyro was talking about. Let me get to that in just a second. The tie-ins, I think, make sense. I do think the area feels kind of orphaned, which is a little bit of its charm, ironically, but also it does feel separated from the rest of the prosperity in the city. And how we do that, I think, is challenging. And I think the inventory of all the transportation elements is admirable, but it's a very hostile, I think, environment. I disagree with a couple of my commissioners. I think it really needs some work to make it something that's beyond just being a complete auto-oriented area. I'm curious of what the safety numbers are like. I don't know if there is pedestrian or non-motorized safety concerns there. I would suspect there would be, but that's maybe something that should be highlighted here if it is so. I love the idea of renaming it Saigon Boulevard. I think that's a great idea. My question though is, Mr. Hyro's comments are very well taken. It's obviously something that we struggle with, not just here, but around the country. The Eden Center itself is one owner, right? And so, much as we want to preserve the business, there's really nothing to prevent somebody from coming in if they wanted to and redeveloping the entire site. Is that right? And if so, does it make it to Mrs. Teet's comments? Does it make it easier for us to actually develop a compelling vision if you have just a handful of property owners that we can work with here? I'm just something I was just thinking about as we were going through this, but very curious to know if that is just one property owner for the Eden Center or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fuentes. I believe it is one property owner. I'm pretty sure it is. I'm pretty sure it's just one property owner.
Yeah, that's correct. So the entire acreage is under one ownership, and then some of the spaces that are leased are then sublet, but it's all under one ownership.
And Mr. Hyro's comments still hold, of course, but it is, the property owner could sell the site and do whatever he wants to do he or she wants to do by right. So that's something obviously we need to wrestle with. Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Stevens.
Yeah, just a few comments. I think featuring the Vietnamese culture as the centerpiece for this small area plan is, I think, absolutely necessary. And I agree with Derek's observation that if you're going to overemphasize the tax yield of 401 West Broad and other similar projects, I think it could very easily send the wrong signal. So I think, staff may well want to go back and look at that and be very careful on how those sections are worded. I agree with Corey's comments in terms of the need to emphasize the energy efficiency of buildings. And, I kind of realize on the West End plan, we had 9 different chapters, and I think you've only covered 2 here. And so there's obviously a lot that still has to come, but hopefully that element will find its way into one of the other chapters. I think somehow we should really emphasize the importance of green space in any redevelopment, so that we're signaling to developers especially when it gets down to time to negotiate the voluntary concessions, that green space is going to be a very important item in any redevelopment project due to the lack of parks that are in that area. So anyway, I'll leave it at that for right now, and look forward to future iterations of the plan.
Come on, go ahead.
I agree with all of my planning commissioner's comments, and especially Mr. Hira's comments about the potential displacement of the tenants. And I also wanted to point out that I think it was 2014, there was a dispute between a number of the tenants at Eden Center and their landlords at the time. I don't know if those landlords are the same landlords. There's a Washington Post article, I can send it to you, Paul. They were complaining about the conditions of the buildings, and they had some pretty serious issues. And so I just was curious if we know what the state of that relationship is right now between the tenants and the landlord. And I also have questions about how we would be able to put in grids of streets through private property. I guess you would just work with the owners on that, Paul. Is that kind of how it would work? And those would be then privately owned streets?
Yeah, so the same thing happened up at or is going to happen at the West Falls Church development. That's what's approved, as well as at Founders Row, where they introduced streets. But there is a value in private streets that they can be designed to mimic and match sort of what's around them.
Typically, through redevelopment. I mean, is what would happen. There would be.
Oh, right. The idea. Yeah, sorry. The idea is not for the city to just go in there with bulldozers and start making streets. The idea is that sort of, as, if redevelopment were to occur, that's one of the things to highlight, that if you, just looking at the street network, one of the things that makes it so tough to walk is just everything is so apart. And the idea of bringing buildings up to the street can go a long way in that regard.
Yeah. Well, you all have obviously put a lot of thought into this, and I agree that it's a very difficult task to plan for this particular area. But yeah, I will send that article about the dispute, and I don't know if anybody else, any of my fellow commissioners, know anything about that current situation. No, okay.
I think I heard something about it. It does sound vaguely familiar. I mean, obviously, you hear about stuff happening at Eden Center. I think there were some articles about it. I agree. I don't know. It has changed hands a couple times over the years. That I know. I don't know who owns it now.
At the time, Paul might know. At the time, it was former personal injury lawyers Douglas and Norman Ebenstein of Boca Raton, Florida.
I think
that was who was sued.
Yeah, I don't know who owns it now. I mean, I know it's changed hands. It's the shopping center asset. It's the kind of thing that commercial real estate investors, can and do, sell these things, and that is something. But that's where the planning process comes in, because, if we want to incur, to the extent we would want to allow anything beyond what's allowed by right. I mean, by right today, it's essentially what it is retail. If we wanted to allow other things, I mean, that's where the planning process becomes so crucial, to lay out the roadmap for what we would encourage and what we wouldn't encourage in any type of, discretionary approval process. So, that's where the plan really, is so important. Mr. Point,
I just.
Go ahead, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
is
off.
it me? I just worry like it would incentivize allowing additional uses on the property would incentivize like the total redevelopment of the property, and then you would lose all of what's special about Eden Center.
That's where the plan.
It's tricky.
Right, that's very important. If we were talking about allowing, getting maybe some targeted areas to allow some infill, or some of the areas that are large surface parking, or some of the, other type of uses that could be. Again, it's hard to. It is in some ways the hardest part of the city. I mean, it's the most auto oriented. It's somewhat, cut off from the rest of the city. And so, even starting to talk about redevelopment and what that might look like, it's a challenge here. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But I'm glad that we started off with getting input from, business owners and tenants in that area. But yeah, I think it's a difficult thing. We start talking about developers, building some type of housing in this POA, what would that do? And again, do you start to the owner of the shopping center start to think about the tenant mix and raising rents, and then you start pricing out. It's a slippery slope. Some of it is the market, but if we increase what we would allow here based on zoning and comp plan, it's like it can be a cycle. And I think that's what Mr. Ira was kind of getting at. But it's something for us to continue to talk about. Mr. Ira, your hand is back up.
Yeah, I just had first of all, let me just say, great conversation, and everybody's comments have been, I've really appreciated them. Paul, this one's for you. I mean, I'm curious, has there been outreach to the landowners? Because this is unique that it's a lot of big parcels and there aren't that many owners. So one, I want to know whether you reached out to them and have started initial conversations with the owners. The other part is, I'm assuming that some of the landowner representatives, like land use lawyers, showed up at the first community meeting. And were they there? Did they comment? Or are we just sort of kind of moving along without them right now?
So no, so we have reached out to them. We're not moving forward without the landowners. And so we've had several conversations with the representatives for the Eden Center, and in fact, one of them was there at the kickoff meeting. He was actually one of the first ones to make opening remarks at the mic, and one of the things he committed to is that the Eden Center is there to stay. So they like the way the center is operating. It's very stable for them. They're very proud of the fact that it is a Vietnamese American site. And they don't have any intention of doing anything with the property anytime soon. When we have engaged them in conversation, what they are looking for is things, like I mentioned, sort of the regulatory flexibility on things like outdoor dining, and modest things they can do to keep the center running, largely in its current form. We've reached out to the other landowners as well. We haven't been as successful in connecting with them, but we are working phone lines to try and find the right person to talk to at the national chain to come talk to Falls Church. So we're trying to figure that out.
All right, well, yeah, thanks. I mean, and the reality is that things are happening around there that are affecting the land value without our intervention. But I do think we need to be careful when we're thinking about, doing a rezoning, because then we are incentivizing particular units, or not units, particular uses. And we're also raising the price of the property. So then maybe we could be incentivizing people to sell. And then, we don't know what the new owners may want to do with the property. So it's just, I think we need to be cautious and careful, and real thoughtful as we move forward with this. But I know that you guys on the planning staff are doing that, and it's an interesting site. I mean, there is a lot of potential for other uses and for development. But it's tricky to do something that enhances economic and social vitality without displacing some of the businesses, which I think are critical, crucial, really add value, even if they don't add, something else could add more economic value, but maybe not the social value and that we are looking for. So let's just be cautious and careful.
Yeah, I think you're right on the planning paradigm would tell you that redevelopment is not the goal. The goal is to actually build a community. Now, what's right and what everybody's talking about, there's already a community there. So it's not about redevelopment to push out the existing community. It's about sort of what investments do they want to make, and can the plan support them? One thing we've been talking about, and we haven't gotten to these chapters yet, but things like transportation, the renaming of the road to Saigon Boulevard, the installation of crosswalks, the idea of public art. When we looked at CIP investments in the area, as far as what the city's put into the area, the city has put in the Roosevelt and Roosevelt intersection, which is north of this, and a bike share station also north of this. well, what's the public investment that needs to go into to make this a more walkable space? Can we do investments in Fort Taylor Park? Is there somebody that wants a playground on their site nearby and we can work with them? So it's not just sort of redeveloping what's there. On the rezoning, you're right that the plan needs to talk about rezoning in the right way. And we've done that in the other small area plans where we've talked about, well, gosh, you might consider a rezoning, but only if it achieved these goals. So that's one thing, is you want to get your planning principles written down the right way in the plan, so that everyone knows why you're thinking about, even entertaining a rezoning application. And then the other thing is that just in the city's history, the city doesn't really do proactive rezoning. The stance on council and staff has always been to wait for an application to come before it, and that way you're really holding all the entitlement cards, because nothing happens without that vote.
Yeah.
So long as the by right zoning doesn't leave you with options you don't actually want. So that's always something to consider. But in this case, it's M1 zoning, which gives access. I was looking it up here. It's a pretty limited set. Well, it's not that limited because it also gives you access to B3. So it gives you access to business uses, but it doesn't really give you access to multifamily, which is currently where a lot of the market wants to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are all great points. Paul, one thing I would recommend is, if, and again, I don't know what with staff's capacity, whether there's time to do this, but when you're doing your outreach, I would specifically do outreach to the small businesses. I would be proactive. I wouldn't wait for them to come to our community meetings. I would actually go get somebody, and you might need a consultant, who has expertise in the Vietnamese community, and who has trust and buy-in, who could go out and actually ask the businesses, what do you need? What do you want? How have you survived through this pandemic? So that we have a better understanding. It's one thing to go to the owners of the land. It's another thing to go to the business owners who are on the land. And I would recommend that with this planning process, that there is outreach that is done to the small businesses.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's important.
See, I see just looking in the chat, Phil Duncan said that, let's see here, that Alan Frank briefed the chamber on his side of the story of the landlord-tenant dispute. So yeah, I'm sure there were two sides to that, but it just speaks to the fact that, there's a sensitivity here. I'm sure a lot of these tenants, again, they've kind of, I think the owners of the property are not from the Vietnamese community. So there's that element too. And, again, just the facts of the matter of, right, many of the tenants probably don't live in the city of Falls Church. Some perhaps do, but I'm sure the majority do not. And, again, so there's that element of the city being, again, this, larger governmental entity kind of coming down, going top down, where we don't want to be perceived as being top down. We want to be perceived the other way. So all great points. Well, let's see. I think let's see. But I'm gonna try. Your hand is still up. I think that's left over, right, from before. Or did you have more?
No, there's no more. Let me just take it down.
All right, I had another screen on. So again, I think it's we're going to see this multiple times. Hopefully, this has been helpful for staff to get our initial responses and reactions to it. To me, I think again, it's a challenging area. Obviously, from a walkability standpoint, it's probably the most difficult for us to begin to get a handle on. To me, that's the biggest thing. Seven Corners, even in vehicles, sometimes can feel somewhat difficult to travel through. And traveling it on foot or bike is near, I don't want to say impossible, but scary and confusing, and certainly not something that encourages people to want to do that. So there's certainly room to improve the urban form here, and then looking at sort of bigger picture change as well. But obviously there are many things just to take what we have and improve the built environment there. So we'll look forward to seeing this continue to evolve on a number of fronts over the course of the coming months, and look forward to working on this part of the city. It's a part of the city that sometimes people who even forget is part of the city of Falls Church. There are some Falls Church residents that don't even realize that BJ's is in the city. They think it's in Arlington or Fairfax. For an example, just some people just don't, because it's so different in form and everywhere else. And I think that's something that we should also try to work on, is making sure that it has that identity of being it's a distinct neighborhood for sure, but it's as much a part of the city, as Founders Row. I mean, it's we're not big enough where we can afford to turn our back on anybody, and this definitely, I think, fits into that category. So, well, if there's no other comments, that was the last last item on our agenda, and so if there's nothing else from staff or from any commissioners, I guess I'll call this meeting of the Falls Church Planning Commission adjourned, and we'll see everybody in 2 weeks at the advance. And next week, I know some folks are going to sit in on the joint ARB meeting for the Founders Row 2. And so if you those folks, feel free to log into that. Otherwise, we'll see everybody in person. I know staff will send out some reminders and on the advance. And I look forward to seeing everybody actually in person, which will be a nice change of pace. So I'm looking forward to that. All right, everybody, take care and good night.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.